right. Good afternoon, everyone. I see that people are coming in, so I'll just give another minute or 30 seconds to let you all come into the virtual room. Mm. All right, I still see people coming in. So, okay, gradually, okay. All right, but I think we should get going. As people will continue to come in, we will just start. So good afternoon, everyone, for those that are in Europe, and good morning to you, Fran, and to all those that might be joining from the US this afternoon for this policy dialogue, the run-up to US elections, and where do things stand. And for those that don't know me, my name is Ricardo Borges de Castro. I'm an associate director and I lead the European World program here at the European Policy Center. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. I think a lot has happened since this group met in December. Also, we are meeting right after the Super Tuesday, and events are happening as we speak. So we know that candidate Haley might make a statement very soon. But indeed, we have a really good panel, as we had the last time in December, to discuss where we are and where things stand at the U.S. Primaries. And so we have with us Frances Burwell. She's a distinguished fellow at the Europe Center in Atlantic Council. We have Ambassador João Valde Almeida. He's an EPC senior advisor and also a visiting fellow at Cambridge University. And last but certainly not least, Georgina Wright. She's a resident senior fellow and deputy director for international studies at Institut Montaigne. So welcome to the three of you also for joining us today again. And before we start, just to let everybody know, so we have 60 minutes to have this discussion. I will start with some opening questions to the panel. I will then we just have a short conversation, and then I'll open the floor for your questions. I would kindly ask you to do those in the Q&A box that you can ask your questions. Please be brief so I can read them at a glance. And also, if you would want to speak viva voce, just let me know, and I'll ask my colleagues to let you into the conversation. So indeed, as I was saying, we are at really just right after the Super Tuesday. A big day, I think, for both candidates. I think both Trump and Biden, President Biden, had good nights. I mean, there was still a woman standing in this race, and she might not be standing, after maybe even during this conversation, but we'll keep an eye on that. But let me start with you, Frances. You are in the U.S. You probably also followed what was happening as it was happening yesterday in the U.S. as all these states were going or all these people were going to the polls. So, I mean, where do you see things at the moment? Also, how you see the campaign, the evolution of the campaign, at least maybe until the conventions. You have the floor, President. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here again. I think what last night did was it really consolidated both parties. It showed that both former President Trump and current President Biden are going to be the nominees. We just, unless something happens, we don't have any other expectations. Trump, after last night, has 1,046 delegates. It takes 1,215 to secure the nomination. President Biden is in a similar situation. This is extraordinarily early in the American system to have this type of consolidation. Usually at this time, we are still, the party that is not in power has several candidates who could still upend things, and there's still a race going on. There is no race now within the parties. There's only a race between the parties. However, there are some significant challenges, I think, particularly for former President Trump. In a number of states last night, he did not actually do as well as one might have thought. In Massachusetts and Virginia, Haley took 35% of the vote. In Colorado, 34%. And of course, earlier she had taken 43% in New Hampshire and 40% in South Carolina. There is a significant number of, let's call them never Trumper Republicans, and as well as independents, some of whom are able, in some states, independents can vote in these primaries, and they are not committed to Trump. And we don't know who they're committed to, really. Nikki Haley is expected sometime in the next few minutes, actually, to announce the suspension of her campaign. We do not, the press is reporting that she will not endorse Donald Trump. And over the weekend, she made clear that she didn't feel bound by an earlier pledge that she would endorse whoever won in the party, because Trump never accepted that pledge. So that's a big wild card. So I would just say that Biden has been doing better among Democrats than Trump has been doing among Republicans in the primaries to date. Much has been made of the uncommitteds on the Democratic side, who are largely voting in protest of American policy towards the Israel-Hamas conflict. I see these votes, and there was another one in Minnesota, almost like 19% of the Democratic voters last night. I see this as a protest. And we see the administration already starting to respond. If you look at Vice President Harris's remarks a couple of days ago, Benny Gantz was in Washington yesterday or the day before, much to the displeasure of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So the administration is responding. Clearly what they want is a ceasefire. Whether they will be able to get that is unclear. But in the end, those uncommitted voters don't have anywhere else to go, given what Donald Trump has said. Let me just point out a couple of wild cards before finishing. First, will Haley endorse someone? Will she remain a thorn in the side of Donald Trump for a long period of time, continuing to trigger him to say wild things and call her bird brain? Second, the court cases. This is just an extraordinary situation. And we now have the Supreme Court having decided that it will rule on the degree of immunity that a president has to commit crimes while in office. And that will probably delay that case against Donald Trump until August, September, if the case goes forward. So right in the middle of the last election season. And we have other cases moving forward. The timeline is being extended on these cases, pushing it closer and closer to the elections. The other thing is, of course, abortion politics. Every time in the midterm that there was something, a state resolution or something like that in support of abortion rights, Democrats showed up. A lot of independents and others showed up and voted for that. So I think that that is an issue that is going to bring out a lot of voters in the fall. There are a number of these resolutions. It's all going to depend on which states they're in and exactly what they say. But that is a seminal issue in American politics today. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Fran, for that initial overview. Also, some of these wild cards, so what Haley might do or not, the criminal cases. So basically, Trump is facing 91 criminal charges, so it's a lot. And of course, then abortion politics that you just mentioned, because these are some of the key issues that are normally debated in U.S. politics under these circumstances. But let me just run through the other speakers. Let me go first to João and then to Georgina. Also, for your first reflections on where you see things after we last spoke, also results of the primaries. Where do you see, and some of, maybe you have also your wild cards or things that you think that might still confound a little bit the process between now and November. João, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Hello to Fran and Georgina, and to all those watching and listening to us. A lot has happened since we last met, and I think it was just before Christmas. But one thing remains the same. This is an extraordinarily exciting election, and maybe a dangerous one as well, if I may, but maybe we'll come back to that later. Fran mentioned a number of wild cards. I would say this is a wild card election to a large extent. But let me try to sort of summarize where I think we are, and I'll use what we know and what we don't know. I think what we know today is that it will be Biden versus Trump again. And we also know that because the decision has been taken so early in the primary cycle, that this will be the longest election campaign ever. So 8 months until November. We also know the main actors because we have had them as presidents before. I think the second thing we know is that this will be a close election, reflecting a divided country. By the middle, if I may say so. And we know that most likely, like last time, this will be decided by a couple of dozen thousand votes. The third thing we know is that, as often in American presidential elections, this will be decided in a reduced number of swing states. And I think most observers converge to say that this will be played in Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The fourth thing we know is that on the 2028 election, the next one, neither Biden nor Trump will be there. And most likely, Nikki Haley will be there. And this is something that we can already almost project into 2028. So what we don't know is a bit longer than what we know. And the first thing, as Fran said, we don't know what will come out of the court cases against Donald Trump. And there are a number of them, as Ricardo just mentioned. We don't know either what will come out of the Supreme Court on the issue of impunity for the president, which is a central issue. Trump has, scored a victory yesterday or the day before on the issue of Colorado ballot, but the impunity issue is potentially even more important. The second thing we don't know, which I believe is crucial for this election, is how will people perceive the economy in November? We know that today they don't reward Biden with the good state of the economy. They still remember what they suffered with inflation, and they have not yet given Biden the credit for the good state of the economy. What will they do? How will they perceive the economy in November is a critical issue. The third thing we don't know, which may be important because of the narrow margins, is what will be the impact of third-party candidates. And I think of the uncommitted on the Democratic side. Will they go for Cornel West? Will they go for the Kennedy who's running now? We don't know, but because the margins will be narrow, this could be important. And the fourth thing I would say that we don't know is what Nikki Haley will do. Maybe she is already announcing it. My expectation goes in the same direction of France, saying that she will suspend. And by suspending, it doesn't mean that her delegates will not go to the convention. They will be there. They are entitled to be there. And they can always be activated again if need be. So will she endorse Biden? There was some rumors about that. I don't believe that. But will she endorse Trump at the end of the day, which is not the expectation? So we don't know what Nikki Haley has done. What we know is that she has accumulated a degree of visibility and even a degree of support inside the Republican Party, which is not to be underestimated. I happen to have been a colleague of Nikki in New York as ambassadors. She was even my neighbor. We were living in the same building. So she's a very tough and very professional politician. So watch out for Nikki Haley. The fifth thing I would say we don't know is the composition of Congress. So it can go either way. If you have Trump plus a full Republican Congress is one thing. If you have Trump with at least a half Democratic Congress is something else. And if you have Trump or Biden with the reverse scenarios, it makes a lot of difference. Last point we don't know is the impact of money. And money is a crucial factor in any American election. I was recently in California talking to the Democrats and Republicans who are somehow involved in the election, and their expectation is that there will be 2.7 billion US dollars available for campaign. And if you think that the campaign is just between two guys focused in 6 states, you know the kind of intensity of negative ads that this can produce. What will be the impact of that remains to be seen. My second point will be just briefly what I think that Biden needs to do and needs to worry about. I think yes, the issue of age that I think he should be well advised to tackle up front. He needs to convince Americans that he's to be credited for the economy, for the good state of the economy, and he needs to, convince people or, invite people to compare him with the alternative, and he needs to provide a better vision for what he wants. In that respect, the State of the Union speech this week will be a very critical, a very important element for Biden to put his case forward. What does he need to worry about? Again, age, which has proven to be a main issue. I think he needs to worry about Kamala Harris, which is another, less positive factor in the perception. And he needs to be prepared for a no pity campaign from Trump's side. I mean, we know how violent the negative ads can be in America. If you put the kind of money I was talking about, this could be a very dirty campaign. What does Trump need to worry about? In my view, suburban women, the abortion issue, the court cases, his association with Putin that can backfire if ever the situation on the theater of war goes into a negative reaction, and he needs to worry about the support that Haley has been able to congregate, and what that combined with independence could play in the actual election. So these are some points for our discussion.
Thank you, João, also for unpacking so much. So, Georgina, we have heard about some wild cards, also the knowns and the unknowns. We also now know that Mrs. Haley has said that she will not endorse Trump. She's not endorsing Trump, and she's hoping that the president can convince her supporters to support him. She leaves also the door open to endorse him in the future. So let's see how. But these are news that are coming in, so I don't want to misreport. But this is something that is coming to me at the moment. But Georgina, how do you, after so many things that have been unpacked, also and brought already by Fran and João, what is your take? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you to EPC for bringing me back for this interesting conversation. I mean, it's very difficult to go after Fran and João because they've just outlined pretty much all my main points that I jotted down from analysing this the Super Tuesday result. But I think it's the top thing, and both Fran and João have said this, is it's now going to get really nasty, and I think we just need to be prepared for that. Trump has already, I was actually asking my team earlier to sort of track everything that Trump had said about Europe and what a Trump 2 presidency might look like for Europe. And he said little things here and there, but he hasn't actually really made it sort of a prominent feature of his campaigning so far. And I think we need to be ready to hear, even though we must all be aware that this isn't about Europe, it's not about foreign policy, it's about all those other issues that have just been mentioned, that when Europe does come up in conversation, frankly, whether it's on the Democrat side or the Republican side, it might be quite negative in terms of, Europe's not just not doing enough, it doesn't support us on China, it's not doing enough to support Ukraine. And it will be, I think, a tense moment over here in terms of how do we plan for whatever outcome in November. And this, of course, coinciding with our own electoral cycle with the European Parliament elections taking place in June. I think one of the things that I'll be looking out for will be how the uncommitted voters, what side they get, or whether they decide to show up at all. I think in 2020, they said around 35% of Americans didn't vote. And actually, that tends to favor Trump. So the greater the level of abstention, the more that is likely to support Trump. At least that's what some of the polling shows. I'm not a pollster, and I'm certainly not an American pollster, so this is me basing myself on some things that I've read. So Biden is really going to have to go out of his way to not only convince his own base, which Fran explained is also divided. We talk about a Republican base that's divided, but the Democrat base is incredibly divided as well. But he's also going to have to talk about a positive agenda for the United States. And in a way, at the moment, it seems to be, you know, trust me and I will keep things going. But actually, I think what Americans want to hear is trust me and I'm going to tackle, you know, the huge problems that are facing society. I'm going to try and bridge society. I'm going to tackle criminality. I know immigration is a problem. I'm going to tackle that too. But that's, you know, requires a lot of ideas as well. And we know that, you know, from conversations I have in Washington, that they are really preparing an agenda, and we can expect that to accelerate. But I think there's going to have to be more ideas coming out, because we know what Trump's agenda is basically to say how badly Biden has done, and that might win him a sufficient number of votes. But Biden's going to have to go much further than just say, look at everything I've done. He's got to say what he's going to do differently, and that's going to be really key.
Thank you, Georgina. I mean, if I can stay with you, because you sort of brought already Europe into the discussion and the conversation. I mean, it's interesting that from listening from the three of you, what it seems is that also, I mean, Americans are going to be confronted with a choice between two presidents or two candidates that they also don't like that much, or that they don't think that probably should continue to be president or run for president, because that's a lot also what the polls tells us. But Georgina, you rightly mentioned that your expectations that the campaign will become nasty or nastier as we move forward, and indeed, and then there's also a NATO summit happening in July in Washington. I mean, Mr. Trump has made very disturbing comments about NATO recently, and even encouraging sort of Russia to attack any NATO country that is not sort of basically meeting their financial obligations. So what might be some of the consequences of, because as you said, I mean, the election is one thing, but until the election, as Ron was saying, we're going to have the longest election period now until November. So how much do you think that election or the campaign will actually have an impact in debates that are happening in Europe as well? Because as you mentioned, we also have elections.
Yeah, I mean, I think until, unfortunately, Hamas's horrific attack, you know, it was all about making progress in Ukraine. That was absolutely key. I was in Washington just before sort of end of September, and there was a real conversation about, gosh, what are we going to be able to deliver at the NATO summit? Because not only is the NATO summit happening a few months before the election, it's also happening in Washington. So we need to show that it hasn't been, you know, what we're seeing right now, which is basically not much. So both sides kind of making moves, but no decisive victory. I think now, unfortunately, with what's happening in Gaza, a lot of the US's attention is focused on that. And I was also recently in the US, and you know, their coverage on the media is all about that, and it's very little, I think, now. Fran would be able to confirm this or not, but I think the focus is mainly on that and not so much on Ukraine. That being said, I think and this is something that we talked about in our last session, Americans across the spectrum feel that Europeans aren't doing enough for their security. This isn't just a Republican fight or a Republican demand. This is also a demand that comes from the Democrats. They say, you're not spending enough on defense, you're not doing enough to secure your borders, you're not doing enough to support Ukraine. I think there has been some maneuver there and a lot of kind of public diplomacy from European allies to show that actually they are, you know, spending a lot to support Ukraine. They are trying to, and Macron's comments, whether, you know, maybe he needs to work on his strategic comms, but it was also an attempt to show that you know, France is getting very serious about this and trying to pull its weight. So I think they will, you know, Europeans will have to show that either they're spending more on defense, they're projecting to spend much more on defense over the coming years within NATO. But also that continually hammer home that actually they want Ukraine to win, and they're prepared to go to lengths to do it. But of course, what we've seen over the past 2 weeks doesn't help, give Americans confidence that we're able to do that. I mean, you've got, Franco-German disputes, and actually this is what I meant to say, and this in the cacophony, and then of course calls from industry saying it's all well and good asking us to produce more arms, but where's the money going to come from? Do we have access to all the materials we need? Can we produce fast enough? So I think we need to do our groundwork as well, even though, as I said a while ago, this has got nothing, the US election, Europe is not front and center of this. This is very much about other issues.
Thank you, Georgina. And Joe, if I can now go in reverse order, and to you first, Georgina just mentioned also, recent remarks that President Macron has made about nothing should be off the table, and also as an attempt maybe to placate some criticism in Washington. But I mean, as you were saying, this is going to be one of the most divisive elections that we have seen, and really because Americans are split. So how can we also expect that this split might affect, transatlantic relations, some of the issues that Georgina was just mentioning, or is this something that will not permeate so much? Let's say the campaign at the elite level, it will be very much sort of scrutinized, but is this permeating the campaign as well?
I think we can expect a sort of symmetrical split, although in a different way in Europe. Let me start by the sort of more positive assessment. Since the last time we spoke just before Christmas, I think there is a higher degree of awareness of the risks of the American election compared to what we had assessed in December. There is a higher degree of convergence on the dangerousness of the possible scenario if Trump wins. But we are still far from a kind of unity of purpose, and even less so a common vision or a common action plan on how to deal with the America withdrawing, or partially at least withdrawing from Europe and from NATO, and from the effort that is required to help Ukraine win the war. So I said that I was very worried in December by the prospects in America. I still remain very worried. I'm slightly less worried about Europe, but I'm still worried about the focused on the need for us to get our act together. This is important for the EU as such, because a number of our member states are on the front line with Russia, directly impacted by Ukraine. All of our member states share the values behind the Ukraine resistance. And we know that Europe will be a different place if Putin wins. So, but it's also important for NATO, critically important for NATO. I believe, for instance, that it's crucially important that the next Secretary General will come from one member state of the European Union to consolidate the links also between EU and NATO, and to address, the challenge that we have ahead of us. This is important for the West, for G7 and the community of liberal democracies, and it's important for the global order. So I think what is at stake in America in these next 8 months is a lot. What do I fear the most? And maybe I'm not the only one. I fear a Trump victory. I fear the fact that he may empower Putin and weaken Ukraine. I expect him to harden his stance versus China, which is not without issues for Europe, that he weakens NATO on the West. And in fact, we could have a sort of race to the bottom on Russia and Ukraine, and the race to the top on China in terms of aggressiveness towards our Asian partner. In these scenarios, Europe has to pay more. It has to pay more in terms of defense, security, and support for Ukraine, and it has to pay more in terms of economic costs by an increased de-risking or even decoupling from China. So, the good thing is that people are more aware, and our leaders seem to be more focused on this. The less good news is that we still see enormous divisions. But I will point out the fact that this week, we had on the same day Super Tuesday and the Commission's defense industry strategy. So they are of relatively different importance, but the fact that they come together is very symbolic of the interrelation, the interaction between the American elections and what Europe needs to do to defend itself and to defend its friends.
Thank you, João. Indeed, I think it was an important day as well yesterday for I think for Europe, at least because it shows that there is movement, as Georgina was saying, on some of these issues. I think this is also important to be read over the other side of the Atlantic, and precisely on the other side of the Atlantic, Fran. I wanted to come to you because it seems that the consolidation also of Mr. Trump as a candidate will continue sort of undermining the unlocking support for Ukraine in Congress, because now this issue is tangled into also because the issues of immigration policy and so on. So I mean, first that, so if you could also maybe reacting to some of the points that Georgina and João made on how some of these things are being perceived. I think both of you, Georgina and João, answered Jolita's question, which was indirectly also you answered, because their question was how a Trump victory might affect transatlantic relations. I think you gave us a little bit some of the pointers that this could be, but Fran, if you wanted to add something on that as well, but really what can we expect in Congress now, even if they're not he's not yet elected and he's already sort of shaping in a sense decisions there. Yeah.
Let me first say that in terms of US perceptions of what Europe is doing, I think that Georgina, not to criticize, but really overestimated in what she was saying, the amount of attention that the American body politic pays to what's going on in Europe, other than a war in Ukraine. People are not watching Macron versus Scholz, et cetera, except for a small group of people like me. But in terms of how that plays into our election, it doesn't. There has been, I think, an important shift. And that is among those who are supportive of Ukraine in the United States. There's a realization that Europe now is doing more and that we cannot get our act together. And so the passage of the last EU package really had a very positive impact, I think, on the view of Europe as an actor, as a capable actor and a willing actor. Now we have the long-term issue of defense budgets, and that's a bigger thing. It will have even more of a highlight during the NATO summit. But I think that there has been an important shift among those who support Ukraine. For those like Donald Trump, where this is really about grievance, so it is, it feeds into traditional American isolationism, his campaign does, and it's also about grievance of anybody who has done anything against him. So he may come out before the NATO summit with a big policy statement on NATO, but even if he does that, he's very unpredictable in sticking with his policy statements, right? It just is off the cuff a lot of the time and depends upon what was said in the situation that he is in at any particular time. It could be that the NATO summit is an occasion for him to really rail against the allies. I wouldn't be surprised by that either. So we'll just have to see. In terms of Ukraine and Congress, I have to say that right now I am not optimistic. And in fact, I would not be surprised to see the package of support for Ukraine delayed until it becomes too embarrassing right before the NATO summit. We've now had this absurd situation where the Democrats put forward a package. The Republicans said, no, it has to have border funding in it. The Democrats and Republicans negotiated that. Biden said he would approve it. And then Trump said, no, I want this issue, basically said, no, I want the immigration issue to persist. And that whole package fell apart. Now, the Senate has passed a Ukraine package. The House is has said the Senate package isn't good. It also includes money for Israel. And the House has said this is not good. But the Speaker, Mike Johnson, cannot get anything through his very fractured group. And so they're talking as well, again, about including immigration fund, border funding in that. So it's been back and forth for the last 2 months, and we're not really seeing any headway. So I remain relatively pessimistic about that. I would say, though, that among Democrats, among the US population overall, more and more people are coming to the conclusion in polls. There was a poll released last week where US citizens who say that we are funding them too little, Ukraine too little, or just the right amount. So continuing with funding, moved from 55% to 60%, among Democrats from 68% to 82%. And even among Republicans moved slightly, but from a much lower level, 39% to 43%. So there is movement that way among the public, but Republicans are not even at the 50% mark yet. And that is the problem with getting this money out the door.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Fran, also for that sobering assessment of what we should be expecting and preparing for. But if I can, I mean, today is also another day that I think it's relevant in this context, because the European People's Party is meeting in Bucharest. It will anoint Mrs. von der Leyen as the candidate of the European People's Party, at least for the Commission. And I mean, she has manifested her intention to be the next or to run again for a second mandate or to do a second mandate. I mean, is this in any way important in your sort of from your assessment? You know, how do you look at her potential, you know, second mandate, and how do you see this shaping transatlantic relations? And then I'll come to João and Georgina, and then start answering some of the questions from the audience, because they're coming in and very interesting. So Fran, please.
Just briefly, she's very well perceived in Washington. She obviously gets on very well with President Biden. And I think that both through the legislation, but even more so through the way she has been forthright, her early trip to Bucha, for example, in Ukraine, and other things, that her attitude toward our little fracas over the Inflation Reduction Act, where she really tamped that down and looked at it as a more constructive element, the US finally funding climate change related steps. I think she's very positively perceived and seen as a second commission for her, a second term for her, would be seen as an element of stability in a relationship that is likely to have a real percentage of instability in the coming years. So I think that that will be seen as obviously the Europeans' choice as they vote, but
Yes.
a welcome development.
All right, João and Georgina. João, if you have any take on this also, this idea of stability, let's say, with all this instability that could be coming also from Washington.
I'm slightly less optimistic than Fran, and I think of two issues. One, if it's not Biden and if it's Trump, Trump will never like a friend of Biden's, right? So I think we'll have to think about that possibility, the scenario of a Trump presidency and the relationship with Mrs. von der Leyen. The second issue is that I think the von der Leyen second mandate, if it happens, will be quite different from the first one, in the sense that the context in Europe has changed. Take, for instance, two issues that will be central in any case to this relationship: trade and net zero. On both these fronts, she is likely to be more on the defensive side. She will have to play tougher if she wants to please the likely constituency that will elect her. And that constituency will move to the right. That constituency is more critical of the Green Deal and the net zero, and particularly critical of the external dimension of net zero and the extent to which the European industry and the European farmers are impacted by unfair competition coming from other countries, and that includes the United States, if you can see the IRA. The same largely for trade. I don't see a more trader-friendly context in the next 5 years than the one we had up to now, which was not that friendly. Just take the case of Mercosur and how difficult it has been for the institutions to have it pass through a member state. So I expect, even if Biden wins, the relationship to be more complicated than up to now. And if Trump wins, God knows what will happen. I hope it will be fine. But I'm slightly less optimistic than Fran regarding this relationship. And I want to stress the economic dimension of it, the regulatory dimension of it. There are a number of challenges ahead of us regarding, for instance, AI regulation or the continuation of the problems with the tech industry. I see a lot of potential conflicts here where I would like to see rather cooperation. If you take the regulation side, we are faced with a huge challenge coming from China. What is our option? What is our best option? Is it to compete between or across the Atlantic, or between us and UK and the US, or rather to have a more cooperative approach to regulation that enables us to be better placed to face the challenges coming from China? And in this context, just to say that, because I finished my career as ambassador to the United Kingdom, I think there is scope here for better cooperation between us and UK, in any case regarding the American election, but particularly if Trump is elected, there is a strong case for us to deepen our relationship with the United Kingdom in all the fronts that we have been discussing.
Thank you, João. Georgina, over to you. Also with this more positive aspect that João just mentioned of the opportunity to have also a better relationship between the EU and the UK in going forward. But also your take on Mrs. von der Leyen, how things are shaping in Europe, and what might be some of the impact of also on some of the points that you're raising, such as security and defense and other issues that you might want to refer to, please.
I mean, I completely agree with João on the sort of von der Leyen Biden versus von der Leyen Trump dynamic. I also think that in some member states, they've been quite critical of von der Leyen's proximity to Washington. And I think there has been implicit sort of, we'll support you as a candidate again for President Commission, but you need to slow down the sort of love fest with Washington. And there are certain things that are great, and it's, if the EU was able to adopt as many sanction packages, because we always lament that it's not going fast enough, but I sometimes think, my goodness, I can't remember a time where we were acted so quickly. That's thanks to close coordination with Washington, but also other G7 allies, including the UK. So for some things, it's very good. But I think on other things, and particularly those points about regulatory divergence, I think the Biden administration was disappointed that they weren't able to make more progress in the TTC, for example, so the Trade and Technology Council. And I think some of that resistance was really from the council, from member states who just didn't feel comfortable about maybe losing their sort of what they see as high standards to kind of converge with the United States. So there will be difficulties, but undeniably Biden's a much easier, I think, US president to work with than President Trump would be for von der Leyen and for the EU as a whole. Beyond that, some of the points, I mean, I think the defense, now I haven't read the defense strategy, the defense industrial strategy that the Commission has published. So this is really just a take from conversations that I've had. I mean, I think it is problematic if we think that there is a possibility that Trump comes back to power, that he decides in some way to either, take the US out of NATO or to reduce significantly the US's contribution to European security. Does it make sense for Europeans to talk about defense procurement without including the UK? I don't know. If we're thinking about European security, which is, broader than the EU, of course, I know all the difficulties with that. There's the single market, there are obligations. You don't want to give, American defense industry has been asking for greater access to the EU's defense market. So we know that if you grant some exceptions to third countries, then you're opening, Pandora's box to everyone. But I think, and I hope Charles right, that there will be a strategic conversation about what European security as a whole means, what the EU's role is. and how the EU can work with its European neighbours that are not members of the EU. And I think at the moment that it's quite easy to see how you work with Norway. It's much harder to see how you work with the UK. But I also think there needs to be, and we talked about this last time, a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in the UK. There's an election happening in the UK at some point, probably this year as well. We don't know if it's going to be sort of May time or around the US election. At the moment, polls suggest that the Labour Party would come back to power. And I think sometimes when you talk to the Labour Party, they sort of assume that because they're not the Conservative Party, they'll get everything that they want and that things will be much easier. And I think the EU is anything but, it has rules and it has ways of doing things. It can change, and it has shown that over the past 5 years, it is able to react and act in times of crises. But there are certain fundamentals that don't change. And I think the Labour Party would be wise to remember that.
Thank you, Georgina. And thank you also for bringing the defense issue. I mean, the defense and security has been sort of throughout the conversation. If I can now group 3 questions that relate to this, I'm going to ask them my own way. So I apologize to those that really actually wrote the questions. But basically, I think one is, should Europeans be preparing for whatever outcome of the US election? And should we be doing more on security and defense, irrespective if it's Trump or Biden? And also on a better political internal coordination at EU level. I think the other question is interesting because it's sort of, should the EU de-risk from the US on security and defense to a certain extent, and also diversify its relationships not only on defense but also in other areas, but with countries such as Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, the UK we just mentioned. And also last but not least, there's a question whether there should be a form of collective EU membership of NATO. So would this be an idea that would make sense to you? So maybe, Georgina, I start with you already. Any of the points that you might want to pick up on this security and defense? So prepare for any scenario, de-risking from security in the US, and also then this collective EU membership.
I mean, I think as a think tanker, I should have lots of proposals and ways of genuine ideas, but the honest answer is I don't have a very good response to this. On the very point about an EU position with NATO, I think it's better to support closer EU-NATO coordination, which is what Charles said earlier, than sort of expect anything else. I think the European pillar of NATO is something we hear more and more spoken about, even in Paris, and I think that's sort of almost more important, really, in the context of NATO, because it of course includes NATO allies that are European countries but not members of the EU. So I think that's certainly something it's more of a NATO discussion. But on defence, I think the debate now in the EU and across Europe is not should we spend more on defence, but how do we spend it and where does the money come from? And that is going to be key. That this defence industrial paper is presumably a step in that direction. I think the Commission sometimes, I say this I really like the Commission, sort of a family, my parents worked for the Commission, so I'm sort of a big fan of the Commission, but sometimes I think there's a tendency to think that, the Commission can make the right choices about what projects to support. And I actually think that particularly in the defence industry, we've got to make sure that there is a very, very close ongoing dialogue between the European Commission, but also member state governments and industry and companies to really understand what is it that they need. And when they talk about certainty and long-term certainty, we're talking about investment over a couple of years. We're talking about investment for certain projects. Are we talking about investment that are cross-national, transnational? I mean, these are all issues that's what industry needs to know right now is the certainty angle. So I really hope that comes out in conversations, and I think it would benefit from multi-stakeholder discussions. On the other points, I think there are, artificial intelligence is not my domain, so I'm not even going to try and pretend I can answer that. But I think it is key. Even yesterday, there were quite a number of reports about sort of fake tweets in the context of the US presidential election, and this is a fake picture and don't believe it. And I think this is going to be something that we're going to talk about in the context of the European election and elections taking place across Europe. And of course, disinformation coming from Russia, but also China as well. And then on the de-risking economic security angle, well, I think a lot's going to happen over the coming years. I think the Commission's agenda work sort of dies down slightly after March because we're in an electoral period. We need to wait until there's a new Commission, but that certainly is going to be front and center. So I would think defense, economic security, and then competitiveness at large, how to make sure that the European continent remains an attractive place to invest in over the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you, Georgina. João, this idea of diversifying our security and defense relationships as well, or this EU collective membership of NATO.
Well, let's be clear about one point. What happens in the US has a huge impact in the EU, and that's a given, and we should not, ignore that. So there's a huge challenge for us, whether Biden wins or loses, or Trump wins or loses. The second issue is that we are on the verge of moving towards a war economy. And the European Union was not made to be a war economy. We are not equipped in our genetic code. We were made to manage peace and consolidate peace and avoid wars and prevent wars. We are not equipped in our genetic code to deal well with a war situation, and even less so war economy. So the challenge is huge. You have both the uncertainty regarding the position of the US, regardless of who wins, because the trends in the US are the ones we have identified, and at the same time we are somehow forced to change our DNA to adapt to an extremely difficult situation. So these are huge challenges. On the calendar, I think 2024, unless dramatic things happen on the theater of war, it will be, to a certain extent, a transitional year because of what we've been talking about. Elections in America, elections in Europe, Mr. Putin certainly waiting to see where things stand, and other actors around the world looking at both of us to see where things stabilize. But 2025, including in the UK, because there will be an election this year, 2025 will be a critical year. The first one in the new US and EU cycle, the first one in the UK cycle, and certainly one in which the war in Ukraine will have to go one way or the other. So I expect 2025 to be a very critical year. On diversification, I mentioned it before relating to particularly trade. I mean, if we are heading towards de-risking or even decoupling regarding China, we have to diversify our trade flows, and the most obvious one is Mercosur. But for domestic political reasons, we are incapable after 20 years or so to conclude this deal, which will represent a lot in many areas. But I think the same principle should apply to security and defense, in the sense of working better with NATO as a EU, to work better with our other neighbors, to work better with our partners in the G7, for instance, and G7 plus, including, of course, Australia, South Korea, and others. So I think there's a lot to say about that, and we need to approach this in a very open and ambitious way. Regarding collective membership of NATO, I don't think this is a good idea, as much as collective membership of the Security Council. I don't think this will happen anytime soon. I think that the direction here should be to strengthen the European Union defense pillar, and in that direction, given the almost overlapping of membership between the EU and NATO, to a large extent, most of our member states are there, to increase our capacity to influence NATO and to work better with NATO. I think this is the way forward, but it has to start at home. It has to start within the European Union.
Thank you, João. Friend, I don't know if you wanted to say anything on these issues, because then there are also two questions that are more related to internal domestic politics in the presidential election, so to say. One is, I mean, what counts most for the election, either of Trump or Biden? Is it domestic issues or it's external issues? And then the second question, I think it's really, I think you alluded to this point already in your initial remarks. So the question is, are folks in the US worried by Biden's Gaza policy alienating black voters? Is this a risk that could tip in favor of Trump? Or, I mean, how are you looking at this issue also? Yeah, please.
So a couple of responses to what's been said earlier, but also let me talk about those two to get them off. Am I? Okay.
Yes, you're fine.
Get them
yes,
off the table. Sorry. First off, Americans, for the most part, vote on domestic issues. They actually don't vote so much on policy. They vote more on whether they trust the person or think this person is the right person to have the job. Donald Trump's strength is that he's seen as the disruptor by people who want the system to be disrupted because they're not, because they don't feel that it's serving their interests. They're not going through and reading, 18 policy points, and I agree with 15 of them, so I'm going to vote for it. It's not the way it works, except in Washington, except among policy nerds, right? But there'll be a few people who will vote on external issues such as Gaza, Ukraine, etc. But it has to be something really big for that to have an impact. I mean, the concern about Gaza is that it will keep people from turning up, showing up and voting, rather than those folks voting for Trump, who has been even more hostile towards the Palestinian area. So I think that that is a concern. I think at the end of the day, those voters, they've sent the message in these primaries, and they now they will go back to the Biden campaign after they see some progress. And I think we're at the beginning of that progress on their issues. On some of the remarks from earlier, yes, absolutely, Europeans need to do more in preparing their own defense, no matter who is elected. This has long been an irritant in US-European relations, the burden sharing. And I think it is, especially when you look at the amount of dollars or amount of euros spent overall on defense across the EU, you should be getting much more for what you pay for. I think a lot of Americans don't realize how committed the EU is to Ukraine. And the more we learn about that, I think the more welcome it will be. But I think the paper that was released yesterday, the one concern I have about it is the explicit targets on how much should be bought from within Europe. And, that will be an issue that I think there should be some serious transatlantic conversations about, and how open the defense market should be. And heaven knows, we don't always have the most open defense market too. If President Trump is elected, I think we can expect a great deal of unpredictability in the relationship, no matter who is head of the commission and president of the council, which also has to be decided. So it's really hard to talk about where will be the problems, because I think the problems will be constant and across the spectrum. 60% tariffs on goods from China is, that threatens a lot of European companies who are exporting from China to the United States. So I think that is a real issue. What we've seen in the Biden administration is a convergence in some areas. So there has been a convergence, I think, on China. We're not unified, but Europe has moved a long way in terms of thinking about de-risking. And we have, for the moment, pulled back from the edge of decoupling. Although I think that any incident, another weather balloon, for example, and Congress could take action that would be perhaps, sanctions that would affect European companies in China and things like that. We have also seen through the TTC, which has helped with the China discussions, the bilateral US-EU-China discussions, a lot of convergence on AI. What are the risks? How do we think AI should be regulated? But we have different systems. So you're doing it through the AI Act. We're doing it through executive orders. There are issues like that. But if President Biden is reelected, it will not all be peaches and cream. It won't all be wonderful. I don't expect a trade policy to become more forthcoming, particularly on market access issues. I think we are seeing a lot of EU trade policies, not all of them passed yet, like the supply chain law, the corporate sustainability and due diligence, which will affect a lot of American companies who have global supply chains. And they're not really focused on this. It's going to come as a nasty surprise if it actually goes through. CBAM is something that we don't have a carbon price. So we haven't figured out how this is going to happen. We have not resolved our concerns over steel and aluminum and overcapacity versus greenness. And my impression is that there's not it's a very difficult road forward in this particular area of the European Biden administration relationship. And those things are going to persist. But the difference, I think, is that with the Biden administration, the relationship will see predictability from the American side, and it will also see strong support for Ukraine and foreign policy issues. So those are kinds of it won't be wonderful no matter who wins, but it will be more stable and more predictable if we have a second Biden term.
Thank you, Fran. Can I steal you 5 minutes because we have 3 last questions.
Okay.
I'll put the questions on the table, and then we go as we started. You first, Fran, then João, then Georgina. You answer whichever you feel most like, or you can answer all of them, but quite briefly. So the first question is: for what kind of scenarios should Ukraine prepare in light of U.S. elections? The second one is: will a potential Trump presidency also change EU industrial approach or EU industrial policy? So relaxed state aid and so on. And the last question, I think we are already addressed to a large extent, but is how will U.S.-China relations have an impact on the campaign, but also will they affect U.S. relations? So, so these are sort of the 3. So Ukraine scenarios for Ukraine, industrial policy at the EU with the Trump presidency, and also U.S.-China relations. Fran, I'll start with you, then João, Georgina, and then we wrap it up. Thank you.
So scenarios for Ukraine, unfortunately, if Trump is elected, I think that we are looking at a much longer war. And I think we're looking at Ukraine and Europe having to reach out to others who are sitting on the fence or who are transferring things that they shouldn't be transferring under sanctions, to be the police on that, so to speak, and to try and get more broader support for Ukraine. On the EU's industrial policy and US industrial policy, if Trump is elected, I think he will dive into industrial policy with both feet. And I think he will make it much more difficult for us to have a conversation about friendshoring, which is what we need to have. We need to figure out a way to do this together. Under a President Trump, I think it will be 2 separate efforts. And finally, US-China relations. I think we will see, unfortunately, both parties in the United States trying to prove that they are tough on China. Can President Biden keep that at a reasonable level? And he's tough on China, right? So can he keep it at a reasonable level? Or will there be spillover from the campaign that does long-term damage both to our relationship with China and also to our ability to do this together with Europe?
Thank you, Fran, for being so brief and touching upon all the issues. João.
Yeah, I largely agree with Fran. My formula, I think, remains. We will see from the US a race to the bottom on Ukraine, Russia, and the race to the top on China. And we need to get prepared for that as best as we can. I don't see really alternative to that scenario. Let me say just one word on the burden sharing. Many of my American friends, I'm not saying friend, but many of my American friends tend to forget the enlargement dimension and how much this is also a security platform and a security factor. And they underestimated the role played by the 2004-2007 enlargement to countries of the former Soviet Union and neighbors, as much as they are, to a large extent, underestimating what it represents for us to accept Ukraine as a candidate country and to eventually have Ukraine join the European Union. There's a lot of security in enlargement. There's a strong security dimension in enlargement that should not be underestimated. So reducing, as I sometimes see in the US, the measure of European commitment to defense by the number of F-35s that we buy to the US is a very narrow path. I'm not saying Fran is on this line of thinking, but just for our next debate, what we have to do is more than that, and what we are doing is more than that. My very final point, I did mention, I realize now, the Middle East. It is crucial that we have a functioning American administration in dealing with the Middle East issue, and particularly Israel and the Palestinian issue. Europe, the region needs the US, Europe needs the US. I think the US needs Europe as well. This can only go in a more positive direction if we all join efforts. But if we have a fundamentalist or a very extreme position on the American side, or a trend towards a non-engagement from the American side, this will make things particularly more difficult.
Thank you, João. Georgina, you have the final word.
I'm going to be very quick because I'm conscious people have other things to go to, and very smart things have been said. But on the industrial point, I'm really struck that there was this whole panic in certain member states, including France, after the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, this fear that European companies would all migrate to the United States. It hasn't really happened that way, and I think there's strong resistance in Brussels, but also in some member states, to not completely relax state aid rules. There is a genuine conversation about competition policy, about making sure that the market is fit to respond to some of the challenges that we see today. If you've got China and the US that are subsidizing massively their industry and putting lots of money on the table, it is attractive for European companies. But I think the discussion will be more about how do we make sure that the EU is an attractive place to invest, rather than how do we race to the bottom and emulate what the United States is doing. So I think, which was sort of some of the debate that we were having late last year or was it the year before, when the Inflation Reduction Act was introduced. So I think the industrial bit is going to be really important for the Commission, but not in a way that's going to completely undermine the sort of basis of the single market. I just don't think many member states want that to happen.
Thank you, Georgina, for that reply. And let me then thank you again, all the participants. Let me thank you again very wholeheartedly, Fran, João, and Georgina, for joining us once more to discuss this. I hope that I can see you, the three of you, together again, discussing the next, then the follow-up to this conversation on US elections in a few months' time. So, I mean, it remains to me to thank everybody that participated, also for such enriching discussion. And I look forward to see you all again soon. Have a nice evening and have a nice day, Fran. Bye-bye.